The story begins not with a whisper, but with a shadow. In the heart of a kingdom known for its splendor and opulence, there existed a palace so grand it seemed untouched by time. Its walls shimmered with gold leaf in the sunlight, while inside, corridors twisted like a living labyrinth, hiding secrets that no visitor dared speak aloud. The citizens admired their king from afar, marveling at his regal presence, yet few knew of the darkness that festered behind the marble facades. Rumors whispered through the streets and taverns. Servants who entered certain chambers and never returned. Advisors who asked too many questions simply vanished. Some said the king himself had sealed away his victims, locking them in rooms from which there was no escape. Stories of cruelty and obsession often blend with exaggeration. But in this case, the line between fact and legend is blurred almost beyond recognition. Chronicles written by court historians, many of whom later disappeared, hint at the king's peculiar habits. He was rarely seen in public without a retinue of silence and watchful eyes, and those who approached his inner chambers spoke of a chilling stillness, an unnatural hush that hung over the air as if the very walls absorbed voices. His court became a theater of fear, where flattery and obedience were currency, and any hint of curiosity could be fatal. The legend begins to take form in the tales of the palace staff. Whispered accounts speak of nightfall, bringing with it a palpable dread. Servants would hear faint sounds, a door creaking open in the dead of night, a muffled cry that seemed to echo endlessly down the stone hallways. Those who dared investigate often returned pale, shaking, and refusing to speak of what they had seen. Scholars and folklorists centuries later would debate whether these were mere echoes of imagination or evidence of something far more sinister. A king who kept his victims alive, yet imprisoned them in a shadow world of fear and silence. Even the architecture of the palace itself seemed complicit in the terror. Hidden passageways, narrow staircases, and false doors gave an impression of opulence to visitors, but insiders knew of spaces designed not for comfort, but for confinement. Behind tapestries, in the depths of the dungeons, or above the ceiling vaults, the king's captives were said to be kept. Mere whispers in the dark, forgotten by all but him. Each room was a cage, each hallway a trap. The king's obsession with control was mirrored in every brick and corridor, a physical manifestation of the isolation and terror he inflicted. Yet, the horror of the palace was not just physical. There was a psychological weight, a tension that gripped those who lived within its walls. People spoke of an invisible presence, a gaze that seemed to follow one's every move, and of dreams haunted by the screams and shadows of the vanished. Fear became routine, and over time, those who remained learned silence, lest they too be consumed by the king's dark world. And so, from the very beginning, the stage was set, a kingdom of beauty hiding a nightmare, a king whose obsession would eclipse all reason, and victims whose fate became legend long before history dared name them. The opening tableau is one of contrast, light against darkness, grandeur against horror, curiosity against dread. In this story, every gilded hallway conceals a secret, every throne carries a shadow, and every whispered rumor hints at the unimaginable. To understand the king and the terror he wrought, we must step into his world, a world where luxury masks malevolence, where whispers tell truths that history itself seems afraid to record. And it is here, in this palace of shadows, that the tale of the king who locked himself away with his victims truly begins. The king's rise to power was anything but ordinary. Born into privilege, he was a child of expectation, groomed to inherit a throne steeped in history and shadowed by the deeds of his ancestors. From a young age, he displayed an unusual combination of intelligence and obsession, an ability to charm and manipulate those around him, while also retreating into private, secretive spaces for hours on end. Tutors noted his brilliance, yet they also whispered of dark fixations, an intense curiosity about control, suffering, and the fragility of life. Those early signs, subtle as they were, foreshadowed the darkness that would later consume the kingdom. As he ascended the throne, The public saw only the polished surface, a monarch of charisma, regal presence, and seemingly unshakable confidence. Crowds gathered in the palace square, mesmerized by his oratory, the elegance of his garments, the precision of his ceremonies. Yet behind the veneer of grandeur lay a restless mind, a calculating intelligence that was as fascinated by human weakness as it was by the trappings of power. Advisors and nobles quickly realized that their king was unpredictable, capable of generosity one day and terrifying cruelty the next. There were rumors that even the most minor acts of disobedience were met with punishment so subtle, so psychologically precise, that it left victims shattered without a trace of violence. Political maneuvering became a kind of theater under his reign. Alliances were formed and broken with quiet ruthlessness, and the king's enemies often found themselves ensnared in webs of intrigue they did not fully understand until it was too late. Some historians argue that this brilliance in statecraft was inseparable from his darker impulses. His obsession with control over others mirrored his need to dominate every aspect of the palace, every action of his subjects, every heartbeat within his walls. He ruled with an almost obsessive precision, ensuring that no corner of his domain remained unchecked, no whisper unmonitored. Yet it was in the quiet moments, away from public ceremonies and council meetings, that the king's true nature revealed itself. He retreated into chambers that were rumored to be inaccessible to all but his most trusted servants, or none at all. Here, his fascination with isolation and secrecy intensified. Accounts suggest he would spend hours or even days in solitude, poring over records, maps, or documents detailing the movements and behaviors of those around him. Some observers believe that this obsession was purely administrative, a reflection of a mind devoted to governance. But the whispers that circulated in the corridors told a darker story, of a king whose curiosity extended to the fates of those he could control, manipulate, or ultimately imprison. The people who worked closest to him began to notice patterns that inspired both fear and awe. Servants who lingered too long in his presence reported feelings of unease, as though they were being measured in some invisible way. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones about the eyes in the walls, a metaphor for the king's relentless surveillance. Even the most loyal nobles were not immune to suspicion. A poorly chosen word, a glance of hesitation, or a moment of dissent could mark someone for removal from favor, or worse. Fear became a currency as vital as gold, and the king wielded it with unmatched skill. As his reign progressed, tales of his cruelty began to trickle beyond the palace walls. Travelers, merchants, and neighboring dignitaries whispered of disappearances, of servants and courtiers who were never seen again. Letters from distant lands warned of a sovereign who relished secrecy, who treated human life as a malleable instrument for his amusement or study. These accounts, while often dismissed by those seeking to protect the monarchy's reputation, only served to deepen the aura of fear surrounding the king. He became a figure both revered and reviled, a monarch whose name inspired admiration in public and terror in private. Psychologically, the king's early life and rise to power reveal a fascinating duality, a man capable of strategic brilliance and social charm, yet prone to obsessive tendencies and dark compulsions. His intellectual curiosity, untempered by empathy, transformed into a tool of control and manipulation. Every action was calculated, every relationship scrutinized, and every corner of his palace monitored. What may have begun as an innocent fascination with order and structure metastasized into something far more sinister, a need to dominate life itself, to bend those around him to his will, and to ensnare them within the labyrinthine world of his making. By the time he had fully claimed his throne, the kingdom had become a reflection of the king himself, magnificent and terrifying, ordered and chaotic, public and privately horrific. To the people who lived under his rule, the king was a paradox, a figure of awe and fear, brilliance and darkness, life and the constant specter of death. And for those who would come too close to his inner world, the palace offered no protection, only the certainty that curiosity could be fatal. Thus, the stage was set. The rise of the king was not merely a story of political success, but the prelude to a reign defined by obsession, secrecy, and unimaginable cruelty. The foundations of power were intertwined with the shadows of the palace, and every act of governance carried a whisper of terror. To understand what would come next, the victims, the locked chambers, and the horrors that lay hidden behind gilded doors, we must first comprehend the psyche of the monarch who would orchestrate it all, a man whose fascination with control would ultimately become a nightmare from which the kingdom could not awaken. The palace was unlike any other in the known world, a monument to grandeur, yet beneath its splendor lay a darkness carefully concealed from public view. From the outside, it appeared a testament to the king's wealth and taste. Soaring towers crowned with gold, marble courtyards that gleamed in the sunlight, and intricate mosaics that depicted scenes of triumph and divine right. To the common eye, it was a place of majesty, an almost celestial dwelling that symbolized the king's power. But to those who moved through its corridors day after day, the palace was a living, breathing entity, a labyrinth designed as much for control as for beauty, and one that held secrets that the world would only whisper about. Every corridor seemed to twist unpredictably, turning back on itself, as if the architecture itself were playing tricks on the mind. Doors led to hidden passageways, and false walls concealed chambers that the majority of the court would never see. Servants spoke in hushed tones of rooms that existed only in shadow, spaces that defied reason and geometry. Some claimed that staircases led to ceilings instead of floors, or that doors once opened would trap the unwary inside endless loops of darkness. The king himself knew every inch of this palace intimately. He moved through it like a shadow, aware of every secret alcove, every hidden nook where a soul could be kept unseen. The more intimate areas of the palace revealed the stark contrast between public display and private horror. The throne room dazzled with crystal chandeliers and polished marble, but a few steps away, behind a tapestry of embroidered gold, lay the chambers where the king conducted his most private affairs. These rooms were deliberately isolated, soundproofed in some places, and guarded in ways that ensured no outsider could witness what occurred inside. The air in these hidden spaces carried a chill that was almost unnatural, a foreboding sensation that grew with each step toward the heart of the palace. Accounts from those who survived the inner workings of the palace describe a disorienting sense of space. Long hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, staircases led to dead ends, and corridors appeared to shift when one was not looking. Some historians believe these were intentional designs, created to confuse and terrify anyone who might stumble upon the king's hidden chambers. Others argue that the tales were exaggerated, a product of fear and rumor. Yet when these stories are pieced together, they suggest a palace not merely built for living, but as a tool of domination, a place where isolation and fear were as carefully crafted as the gold leaf that adorned the ceilings. Even the air within the palace seemed to carry the weight of oppression. Servants reported that walking through certain halls felt like passing through invisible walls, as if some unseen force was pressing down upon them. Shadows moved in ways that defied the flickering of candlelight. Muffled noises could be heard from chambers long abandoned. Some of the more daring courtiers claimed to have glimpsed figures, blurred and silent, vanishing behind doors that no one else had opened. And in the very heart of the palace, the king maintained chambers whose existence was known only to him, rooms where he was said to confine those unfortunate enough to fall under his scrutiny. The palace's design also reflected a macabre sophistication. Hidden vents allowed the king to observe or even listen to the movements of servants without being seen. Tiny peepholes were strategically placed in walls, allowing him to monitor conversations or determine the loyalty of his courtiers. Floors were reinforced in some areas, not for grandeur or utility, but to prevent escape. It is said that some rooms were designed with no windows and no doors that opened from the inside, ensuring that anyone placed within was entirely at the mercy of the monarch. Every aspect of the palace was meticulously planned to reinforce his absolute control, creating a psychological maze as terrifying as the physical one. Legends also speak of secret dungeons below the palace, deep subterranean chambers where the air was said to be thick and damp, carrying a stench that no perfume could disguise. These spaces were described as holding cells, each crafted to break both body and spirit. Some accounts claim that faint cries echoed through the stone corridors late at night, only to be silenced by a sudden, unnatural quiet. The king's obsession with secrecy ensured that these stories, though whispered among servants and courtiers, were never officially documented. Any record that did exist was carefully altered, erased, or hidden, leaving only fragmented tales to survive into later generations. Yet, it was not only the architecture that inspired fear. The palace itself seemed to have a presence, a consciousness shaped by centuries of fear, secrecy, and obsession. Visitors often spoke of a sensation that someone, or something, was always watching, an unseen gaze that penetrated even the bravest of hearts. Folklorists later suggested that the palace had become a repository of trauma, that the walls themselves absorbed the terror inflicted within. Each corridor, each vaulted ceiling, each hidden staircase was imbued with the echoes of those who had suffered under the king's watchful eye. In this way, the palace was both fortress and prison, a place of gilded magnificence and unspeakable horror. It was the perfect reflection of the monarch himself, beautiful to behold, terrifying to experience, and filled with secrets that no one dared confront directly. Every visitor, every servant, every member of the court knew that to step inside was to enter a world governed not by law or reason, but by the will of a man who had mastered control, manipulation, and terror. And so, the Palace of Shadows became more than just a residence. It was a kingdom within a kingdom, a labyrinthine stage for obsession, cruelty, and the beginnings of the dark legends that would endure long after the king himself disappeared from history. To enter, it was to enter a world where power and fear were inseparable, where the walls themselves whispered secrets, and where every gilded hallway could hide a nightmare waiting to be revealed. The story of the king's cruelty becomes real only when we meet those who suffered under his shadow, the victims whose lives were stolen, whose presence was erased from the corridors of power, and whose very existence became a whispered secret. These were not faceless names in historical records. They were servants, courtiers, and occasionally even nobles, whose ordinary lives collided with a mind so consumed by obsession that survival could never be guaranteed. The palace, for all its grandeur, was also a place where fate was determined not by merit or loyalty, but by the unpredictable whims of a monarch whose curiosity was as dangerous as it was relentless. We begin with the servants, the invisible workforce that kept the palace gleaming and functional. Many were young, barely out of childhood, drawn from villages across the kingdom. They were trained to move silently, to anticipate the king's moods, to see without being seen. Yet even the most careful among them were not immune. Stories survive of those who entered the king's private chambers on routine tasks, only to vanish without a trace. One night, a maid carrying linens would be swallowed by a hallway that led nowhere. Another, a young page, would disappear after delivering a simple message. The court whispered of the rooms that eat people, a euphemism that conveyed horror without detailing the unthinkable truth. Nobles and advisors were not spared either. While the king cultivated the image of a fair and just ruler in public, behind closed doors he exercised a more insidious power. Any hint of dissent, a suggestion of disloyalty, or even a fleeting look of disrespect could mark someone for confinement. These were not always permanent disappearances. Sometimes, the victims were held in secret chambers for days, weeks, or even months, subjected to psychological torment that left them broken long before any physical harm was done. Accounts suggest that fear was the primary instrument of control. Those who remained inside the palace saw, heard, or imagined horrors so intense that even brief exposure could leave lifelong trauma. Historical fragments and later folklore provide haunting glimpses into the lives of these victims. One tale speaks of a young musician, summoned to perform for the king in a private hall, who vanished mid-performance. The echoes of the strings reportedly lingered long after the boy's disappearance, giving the impression that even the palace itself mourned him. Another tells of a servant girl who tended the royal gardens. She was said to have stumbled upon a hidden door, glimpsed a shadow behind it, and was never seen again. These stories, while often sensationalized over centuries, share a common thread: the presence of ordinary people who, through circumstance or misfortune, became trapped in the king's private world of terror. The psychological horror of these disappearances cannot be overstated. Families would sometimes wait for months, desperate for news of missing loved ones, only to receive silence. Rumors spread among townsfolk that those who entered the palace and never returned were trapped in the king's hidden chambers, living in fear or worse. Some legends suggest that the victims were subjected to rituals or experiments, while others claim they were simply kept in isolation, stripped of sunlight, human contact, and hope. Whether rooted in fact or amplified by fear, the notion that people could exist entirely at the mercy of the monarch's obsessions created a pervasive atmosphere of dread throughout the kingdom. The victims were more than just statistics. They were people with lives, dreams, and families. Chronicles speak of the fleeting glimpses of them before they vanished. A young apprentice learning the intricacies of court etiquette, a maid whose laughter could light a room, a scholar who sought only to advise wisely. The tragedy is amplified by the stark contrast between their mundane humanity and the monstrous circumstances they were thrust into. Each disappearance was a story cut short, a life folded into the shadows of the palace, leaving behind only whispers and fragmented memories. Court records and letters hint at the king's obsession with cataloging, monitoring, and controlling these individuals. Some suggest he kept detailed journals, noting behaviors, reactions, and compliance. Others describe cages, hidden chambers, or locked rooms designed to isolate victims completely. While historians debate the veracity of these claims, the psychological impact on those who witnessed or survived such horrors was real. Fear permeated every layer of palace life. Even those who were not targeted directly lived under the constant terror of being noticed, measured, and judged. As the story of the victims spreads, folklore begins to entwine with fact. Local legends speak of ghosts wandering the halls, of muffled cries behind locked doors, and of shadows that move independently of light. Some claim that the spirits of the victims linger in the palace, trapped by the violence done to them in life, replaying their suffering for anyone bold enough to notice. Whether these tales are true or symbolic, they serve as chilling reminders that the human cost of the king's obsession was immense. The victims are not just numbers. They are echoes, a haunting presence that bridges history and myth. Even centuries later, the memory of these individuals refuses to fade. Archaeological discoveries hint at hidden chambers, while oral traditions preserve the names and faces of those who vanished. Scholars and folklorists attempt to piece together the fragments. Yet the true extent of the king's cruelty may never be fully known. Each account, whether historical or legendary, carries the same message. In the shadow of obsession, ordinary lives were obliterated, consumed by the king's need for control. Thus, as the palace stands as a symbol of opulence and terror, it is the victims who truly define its dark history. Their stories, reconstructed through whispers, fragments, and legends, form the emotional core of the narrative. They are the human faces of horror, the innocent caught in the machinery of a ruler whose fascination with confinement and control knew no limits. To understand the full scope of the king's depravity, we must follow the lives of those he trapped, whose voices echo faintly through time, reminding us of the unimaginable cost of absolute power. As the palace whispered with the secrets of the missing, rumors of the king's darker obsessions began to take form. Scholars and folklorists often describe his fascination not merely with control or confinement, but with acts that blurred the line between ritual and cruelty, obsession and superstition. In the shadowed halls where no eyes could see, It is said that the king engaged in practices that were at once private and terrifying, weaving together fear, power, and the occult into a tapestry only he could fully understand. These dark rituals were not merely acts of cruelty. They were performances, meticulous in design, intended to exert dominion over life itself. The earliest accounts suggest that the king collected objects imbued with symbolic significance, rare artifacts, bones of animals, and peculiar talismans whose meanings were known only to him. Each object was catalogued, examined, and placed with deliberate intention in rooms where the rituals would take place. Chroniclers describe his chambers as labyrinths of esoteric tools, instruments whose purpose was both ceremonial and sinister. Candles burned in precise patterns, and geometric shapes were carved into floors and walls, creating spaces that seemed alive with intention. Even the most skeptical historians admit that these chambers inspired terror in those who glimpsed them, for they conveyed a sense of obsessive purpose that extended far beyond ordinary superstition. One of the most chilling aspects of these rituals was the way the king allegedly involved his victims. Accounts, some drawn from court gossip, others from the writings of travelers, speak of captives who were not merely imprisoned, but integrated into elaborate ceremonies. Some scholars suggest these were attempts to bend the human will, exercises in psychological domination. Victims were reportedly subjected to sensory deprivation, forced to remain in isolation for hours or days, and sometimes arranged within rooms according to symbolic patterns meant to reinforce the king's control. The effect was to strip them of identity, leaving only the terror imposed by the monarch's design. Folklore surrounding these rituals is even more disturbing. Stories passed down in whispers describe nights when the palace seemed to come alive with strange, flickering lights and faint, untraceable music. Servants who dared approach certain corridors reported hearing chants in languages they did not understand, rhythmic beats that echoed through stone hallways, and sudden cold drafts that seemed to carry voices. Some of these tales suggest that the king believed the rituals connected him to forces beyond the mortal realm, granting him insight, power, or protection. Others contend the ceremonies were simply elaborate exercises in terror, a way to assert dominance over the living and the dead alike. Historians have debated whether these accounts are literal or exaggerated, yet even the most cautious interpretations admit the presence of psychological manipulation, ritualized behavior, and cruelty executed with terrifying precision. Witnesses, when they survived long enough to recount their experiences, spoke of an atmosphere thick with fear, where the very air seemed charged with intention. Lights flickered unpredictably, doors appeared and disappeared, and the king's presence could be felt in the most subtle shifts, a shadow that moved against the grain of candlelight, a gaze that seemed to pierce walls. Every element of the palace was, in these moments, transformed into a theater of terror. One particularly haunting legend tells of a chamber lined with mirrors, where victims were forced to confront distorted reflections of themselves. The king, it is said, would observe from a concealed alcove, noting reactions, recording behavior, and measuring the human psyche against his own obsessions. Some historians suggest that these acts were part of a broader attempt to explore control, fear, and identity, blending elements of early psychological experimentation with ritualistic symbolism. Others, steeped in folklore, claim that the mirrors were portals, conduits for unseen forces, and that those who entered often never returned in the same state, some claiming their minds had been irreversibly altered. The connection between cruelty and belief is a recurring theme in accounts of these rituals. Chroniclers hint that the king may have believed his acts were protective, ensuring the continuation of his reign or warding off enemies, both real and imagined. Yet, even if grounded in superstition, the human cost was undeniable. Victims were stripped of autonomy, reduced to instruments of ceremony, and subjected to sensory manipulation so intense that many suffered lasting psychological damage. Pain, fear, and isolation became tools as precise as any dagger or lock, and the king's obsession with ritual elevated these tools to an art form that few could comprehend, and even fewer could survive. The king's obsession was not limited to private chambers. It extended into the very architecture of the palace. Hidden alcoves and secret passages allowed him to move unseen between chambers, observing rituals without interruption, adjusting environments to suit his designs, and controlling even the smallest details of light, sound, and movement. Doors would lock automatically, candles would burn in prearranged sequences, and ventilation systems were sometimes manipulated to alter the sensations experienced by the victims. Every element of space and time within the palace was harnessed to amplify terror, creating a total environment of psychological domination. Local legends, passed down through generations, further embellish these accounts. Stories speak of nights when entire wings of the palace were filled with an unearthly glow, shadows moving independently of their sources, and faint cries that seemed to seep from the very stone. Travelers reported glimpses of figures through the windows, frozen in unnatural postures, while servants swore that sometimes the sounds of ceremonial chanting would echo from hidden chambers even when the king was known to be elsewhere. These accounts blur the line between history and myth, but the consistent theme is clear. The king's obsession with ritual was not simply private eccentricity. It was a deliberate, terrifying manipulation of those around him. It is also worth noting that these rituals reinforced his absolute control over the palace. Fear became a currency more valuable than gold. Servants, courtiers, and nobles alike learned that to disobey, to question, or even to observe too closely was to risk being folded into the king's dark ceremonies. Silence was enforced not only through punishment, but through the constant psychological weight of anticipation and dread. The rituals, therefore, were not merely acts of personal obsession. They were instruments of systemic terror, woven into the very fabric of governance and palace life. By examining the king's dark rituals, we begin to understand the depth of his obsession with domination. These were not casual acts of cruelty. They were carefully planned, psychologically intricate, and designed to exert control over every aspect of his environment and the lives within it. They reveal a monarch who sought not only to rule, but to manipulate, terrify, and shape reality according to his own vision. In the shadows of the palace, the rituals left scars that outlasted the king himself, shaping the legends, folklore, and even paranormal accounts that would persist for centuries. And so, the dark rituals form a critical part of the story, bridging history and myth, cruelty and obsession, power and terror. They provide a glimpse into a mind consumed by secrecy, control, and fear, and into a palace where human lives were instruments of obsession. Through these acts, the king not only inflicted suffering, but transformed the very spaces around him into living testimonies of horror, spaces that would echo through history long after the monarch himself had vanished into legend. The corridors of the palace were alive with secrets, yet not all were whispered aloud. Among courtiers and servants alike, a pervasive sense of unease settled like a fog, thickening with every passing day. No one truly knew the extent of the king's obsessions, but everyone sensed it, a subtle, omnipresent gaze that seemed to measure loyalty, fear, and silence itself. Conversations were cautious, carefully measured, and laced with double meanings, for even a single misstep could lead to disappearance or worse. In this environment, whispers became currency, rumors a lifeline, and silence a survival strategy. The nobility, despite their privilege, were not immune. Even those who appeared to enjoy the king's favor understood the precariousness of their position. Meetings in candlelit chambers often ended in quiet, uneasy departures, as courtiers gauged each other's reactions, trying to decipher who might have been implicated in the king's private obsessions. Letters were written and rewritten, carefully phrased to avoid offense, and even gestures could be misinterpreted. A frown, a pause, a glance in the wrong direction could mark one for scrutiny, or worse, for confinement in the hidden chambers that had already swallowed so many. Servants, on the other hand, carried a weight few could imagine. They witnessed small, terrifying events. A hallway suddenly empty, a colleague who had entered a chamber and never returned, and the faint sounds of distress that seeped through walls. Some swore that the palace itself seemed to conspire with the king, amplifying fear and paranoia with its twisting corridors and hidden alcoves. Footsteps echoed where no one walked, shadows lingered too long, and whispers carried unnaturally, as though the very stones were recording the movements and words of those within. Among the whispers, certain patterns emerged. Tales spoke of the observed, those who seemed to draw the king's attention for reasons no one could fully explain. They were often individuals of particular intelligence, skill, or beauty, but sometimes it was merely circumstance that marked them. These people were watched closely, their behaviors catalogued, their relationships scrutinized, their fears exploited. Courtiers learned quickly that the king's attention was both a blessing and a curse, for while favor could elevate one to positions of influence, scrutiny could drag one into the shadows of the palace from which few returned. Fear was institutionalized in the court. Advisors learned to speak only when spoken to. Servants memorized invisible rules that governed conduct down to the slightest bow. Even humor became dangerous, for jokes could be misinterpreted as criticism or mockery. The palace, once a place of diplomacy and ceremony, had become a theater of tension, where every glance, every word, and every movement could carry life-altering consequences. Those who lived within it learned quickly that survival depended as much on psychological acuity as on obedience. There were also stories of unusual disappearances that fueled the whispers. A maid might vanish after delivering a seemingly trivial message. A page might be seen entering a chamber but never emerge. Rumors circulated that the king's rituals were involved, that those selected for observation were sometimes used in ceremonies designed to break them mentally and spiritually. Even those not directly affected could sense the growing dread, the echo of screams, the sudden hush in hallways, the unease that permeated even the brightest public celebrations. Fear had become a shadow companion, following everyone who moved through the palace. The whispers were not merely stories. They were attempts to make sense of chaos. Courtiers traded accounts of strange occurrences, lights flickering inexplicably, doors opening or closing without human intervention, faint chanting heard from chambers that should have been empty. Some believed that these were manifestations of the king's influence, others that the palace had become haunted by the spirits of the missing. Regardless of interpretation, the effect was the same. The whispers spread like wildfire, creating an invisible network of knowledge and terror, connecting everyone in the palace through fear and speculation. Even the king's closest allies operated under constant suspicion. Trust was a fragile commodity, and alliances shifted as quickly as moods changed. One misinterpreted action could destroy years of careful positioning, and those who failed to maintain the appearance of loyalty risked exposure to the king's dark attention. Reports suggest that courtiers would sometimes deliberately mislead each other, creating a web of deception and paranoia. Survival required not only intelligence, but also instinct, a delicate dance between serving the king's interests and avoiding the fate of the vanished. The psychological tension extended beyond the palace walls. Townsfolk and foreign visitors caught glimpses of the court's unease, sensing that the splendor they admired masked horrors that could not be named. Diplomatic envoys reported that even formal audiences carried an undercurrent of dread. Conversations were polite but measured, and every gesture was weighed for its potential consequences. The whispers that circulated beyond the palace's gates only amplified the aura of fear, turning the king's reputation into a legend of dread, a shadow that extended far beyond his immediate domain. Ultimately, the whispers in the court were more than idle talk. They were survival strategies, attempts to navigate an environment in which knowledge could be as dangerous as ignorance. They connected the frightened, the observant, and the cunning in a silent pact of awareness, a network of those who understood that the king's gaze could strike anywhere, at any time. These whispers became the lifeline of the court, preserving fragments of truth and rumor alike, and ensuring that even as victims disappeared, the knowledge of their fate was carried forward, faintly, from one generation to the next. The palace, with all its grandeur and terror, became a place where silence was as meaningful as speech, where fear dictated action, and where whispers carried the weight of life and death. In this environment, the king's control extended beyond the physical confines of the palace. It seeped into the minds and behaviors of all who dwelled there. The whispers were the invisible threads holding the court together, weaving a tapestry of fear, loyalty, and survival that reflected the terrifying genius of the monarch who orchestrated it all. Thus, the court itself becomes a character in the story, a living, breathing web of observation and anxiety, perpetuating the king's control through silence, rumor, and the constant, invisible presence of terror. In understanding the whispers, we glimpse the full scope of his power, not just over bodies, but over minds, hearts, and the very essence of those who served, feared, and survived within the Palace of Shadows. Deep within the palace, beyond corridors that twisted like serpents and staircases that seemed to fold back upon themselves, lay the chambers that would come to define the horror of the king's reign. Known in whispers as the locked chambers, these spaces were unlike any ordinary room in the palace. To the casual observer, they were unremarkable: stone walls, heavy doors, and the faint scent of candle smoke. But for those who knew their purpose, these chambers were the epicenter of fear, confinement, and the king's obsession with control. Every detail, from the design of the locks to the placement of the windows, or lack thereof, was calculated to strip away autonomy and enforce absolute subjugation. Historians have pieced together fragments of these rooms from surviving architectural plans, sketches by fleeing courtiers, and later descriptions recorded by chroniclers who dared not enter them. Some were no larger than closets, built with stones so thick that no sound could escape. Others were small cells, just big enough for a single person to sit or stand, but not to lie down comfortably. Ventilation was minimal, lighting dim or entirely absent, and doors could only be opened from the outside. The chambers were designed to disorient and terrify, to make time stretch indefinitely, and to reduce the occupants to a state where fear and isolation became as tangible as the stone walls themselves. Survivors and later accounts describe the sensory horrors of these locked rooms. Without windows or access to sunlight, victims lost track of days, sometimes perceiving hours as weeks. The absence of social contact led to psychological deterioration. Hallucinations, paranoia, and despair were common. Some were placed in rooms with only faint, flickering candlelight, shadows dancing endlessly across the walls, creating illusions that preyed on the mind. Others were confined in complete darkness, the human imagination becoming their tormentor as it conjured every imaginable terror. Every sensory deprivation or manipulation was intentional, a calculated method to break spirits while leaving the body intact. The king's fascination with control extended even to the minutiae of human behavior within these chambers. Observers noted that the walls often contained hidden peepholes, allowing him to watch reactions without entering the room. Some chambers were equipped with small openings through which food could be delivered, but these were designed to limit physical contact and enforce a sense of powerlessness. Occasionally, objects were left inside: books, mirrors, or symbols that the king used to study how fear, hope, and imagination interacted in the minds of his captives. To him, the locked chambers were laboratories, a place where he could measure, manipulate, and master the human psyche. Accounts suggest that the king did not merely confine victims, but arranged them according to specific criteria. Some rooms were reserved for those who had displeased him politically, others for servants or courtiers whose loyalty was uncertain. Legends speak of elaborate numbering systems, keys marked with symbols, and doors that were both physical and symbolic barriers, representing the monarch's absolute authority. Those trapped within were forced to navigate not only their physical confinement, but the psychological labyrinth imposed by their captor. Every sound, every movement, every shadow became a tool of terror, a means of enforcing obedience without overt violence. The psychological impact of these chambers was compounded by their unpredictability. Victims could be moved from one cell to another without warning, or held in isolation for indeterminate periods. Some were subjected to brief moments of light or social interaction, only to be returned to darkness, intensifying the disorientation. Others were deliberately exposed to the cries, movements, or faint screams of other captives, a cruel method of amplifying fear and despair. Every aspect of their confinement was orchestrated to ensure that the mind became as much a prison as the walls themselves. Folklore surrounding the locked chambers adds another layer of terror. Tales passed down through generations speak of corridors that seemed to shift when a prisoner's attention wandered, of doors that appeared and disappeared at will, and of faint noises, scratches, whispers, cries, that could not be explained by ordinary phenomena. Some legends claim that the king believed these chambers could alter the soul itself, that fear and suffering could be harvested, transformed into some intangible power. Others suggest that the rooms were cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had been confined, forever trapped in cycles of terror and despair. Surviving accounts provide glimpses of the human toll exacted by these spaces. One chronicler speaks of a young page, taken for a minor infraction, who spent weeks in near-total darkness and emerged so altered that he could no longer recognize family or friend. Another recounts a maid whose time in a locked chamber led her to speak in whispers to imagined companions, convinced that the shadows were alive. Each narrative, while fragmentary, paints a picture of profound suffering, a psychological landscape as terrifying as any physical torment. The chambers did not merely hold bodies. They ensnared minds, eroded identities, and left indelible marks on anyone unfortunate enough to encounter them. The architecture itself reinforced the terror. Stone walls absorbed sound, creating an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional drip of water or the faint creak of a lock. Floors were uneven, ceilings low in some chambers, high and cavernous in others, designed to distort perception and amplify fear. Doors were often thick and reinforced, preventing escape but also producing an echo that carried footsteps like distant thunder, a constant reminder of confinement. Even the placement of keys and locks reflected meticulous planning. Each chamber could be isolated, yet the king retained absolute control over access. What makes these locked chambers especially haunting is not just their physical construction, but the deliberate, calculated cruelty behind their use. They were instruments of terror designed to exploit human vulnerability, turning ordinary people into unwitting participants in a monarch's obsession. Beyond the architectural marvel and historical fascination, they are a testament to a mind that fused genius and malevolence, turning confinement into both punishment and experiment. Even centuries later, the legacy of the locked chambers endures. Archaeological investigations have revealed remnants of hidden spaces within palaces long abandoned, while folklore preserves the memory of those who were never seen again. Paranormal investigators report unusual readings in these areas, claiming that the echoes of suffering still linger in the stone. Whether through history, legend, or lingering spiritual presence, the locked chambers remain a chilling reminder of the extremes to which obsession and power can drive a single human mind. In the context of the king's reign, the locked chambers were more than rooms. They were symbols. Symbols of absolute control, of fear wielded as power, of lives reduced to tools for obsession. They reveal not only the physical horrors imposed on the victims, but also the depth of psychological domination that defined a monarch's rule. In these rooms, time, space, and perception were manipulated to perfection, creating a private hell hidden behind the gilded facade of a palace that dazzled the public eye. To step into the story of the locked chambers is to confront the full scale of the king's cruelty. It is to see how fear can be engineered, how spaces can be weaponized, and how obsession can transform architecture into instruments of horror. They remain, in memory and legend, a monument to suffering, a testament to the darkest aspects of power, and a chilling prelude to the enduring stories of terror, whispers, and haunted memory that would follow for centuries. Long after the king himself disappeared from history, the story of his reign refused to fade. The palace, with its labyrinthine corridors and locked chambers, became a focal point not just for historians but for storytellers, travelers, and those who thrived on whispers of the uncanny. What had begun as a documented pattern of cruelty slowly evolved into legend, a tale that blurred the lines between fact and folklore. In villages surrounding the kingdom, tales of missing servants, inexplicable cries, and shadows that moved on their own became part of daily life, passed down through generations as warnings and mysteries to be feared. The king's notoriety spread far beyond the borders of his realm. Merchants traveling along trade routes carried stories of the palace's hidden horrors, embellishing details to astonish or terrify audiences. Some recounted narrow escapes from chambers said to consume entire families. Others claimed to have glimpsed the king himself walking unseen through the halls, even centuries after his death. Over time, the accounts became more elaborate, merging historical events with supernatural elements. Whispers of ghostly figures wandering corridors, of doors locking themselves, and of faint cries that echoed through empty halls transformed the king from a tyrant into a spectral legend, part man, part nightmare. Oral tradition played a crucial role in this evolution. Families would warn children never to venture too close to the palace, spinning stories of shadows that could swallow souls, of mirrors that trapped spirits, and of rooms where time itself ceased to exist. These stories were rarely intended as mere entertainment. They were cautionary tales, a means of instilling respect and fear for the unknown, and a way of preserving fragments of truth when written records have been destroyed or suppressed. In this way, folklore became a vessel for collective memory, carrying forward the essence of horror that the king had created long after the specifics had been lost. Local legends often added layers of moral and supernatural meaning. Some depicted the king as cursed from birth, a man doomed to repeat acts of cruelty because of ancestral sins or dark pacts. Others claimed that he had made bargains with forces beyond the mortal realm, trading human lives for supernatural knowledge or invincibility. Victims, in these tales, were not just prisoners but offerings, their suffering sustaining the king's unnatural power. Such stories transformed the king's historical actions into a cosmic horror narrative, one where the ordinary and the otherworldly collided in a palace that had become as much a portal of legend as it was a monument of stone. The legend was further amplified by mysterious disappearances that continued even after his death, or at least after he was no longer recorded as living in the palace. Stories of wanderers vanishing in the surrounding forests, of travelers encountering inexplicable obstacles, and of voices calling from abandoned chambers created the impression that the horrors of his reign were immortal. Folklorists note that these tales often shared common motifs: hidden chambers, shadowy figures, inexplicable sounds, and the idea that the king's malevolence had somehow seeped into the very walls of the palace, lingering across generations. Artists and writers of later centuries also contributed to the legend. Paintings depicted ghostly silhouettes in candlelit corridors, while poems and plays recounted horrors in the first person, as if the palace itself were speaking. These creative interpretations blurred the line between documentation and imagination, cementing the king's story in the cultural consciousness. By the time historians began attempting systematic reconstructions, the legend had already taken on a life of its own, a hybrid of truth and terror that fascinated and repelled in equal measure. Even the palace's architecture seemed to support the myth. Hidden staircases, blocked doorways, and labyrinthine hallways, once practical or defensive, were interpreted as evidence of secret rituals, of captivity, and of horrors too terrible to record. Tourists and later researchers reported sensations of being watched, sudden drops in temperature, and the inexplicable feeling that the walls themselves remembered the suffering that had taken place within them. In this way, The physical space and the stories intertwined, creating a living legend where architecture, memory, and fear merged seamlessly. The legend also served a social purpose. It reinforced the idea that unchecked power could produce unimaginable horror, and that the human mind is vulnerable to obsession and cruelty. The king became both a cautionary figure and an enduring symbol of tyranny's extremes. As stories of ghostly apparitions, disappearing servants, and locked chambers circulated, they shaped public consciousness, warning generations about the dangers lurking behind gilded facades and the hidden motives of those in power. In essence, the legend grew because it was multi-layered. It contained historical truth, psychological terror, moral instruction, and supernatural intrigue, all woven into a narrative that resonated deeply with audiences. Each retelling added new details, interpretations, and embellishments, yet all retained a consistent core. The king's obsession with control, the human cost of his cruelty, and the mysterious, almost alive presence of the palace itself. This legend was never static. It evolved, adapted, and persisted, ensuring that the terror of the locked chambers, the whispers of the court, and the fate of the victims would never be forgotten. By the time modern historians and paranormal researchers entered the story, the line between documented history and folklore was irreversibly blurred. The palace became not only a site of past atrocity, but a locus of lingering fear, a place where the boundaries of reality and imagination converged. Visitors reported cold drafts, inexplicable sounds, and fleeting shadows, phenomena that seemed to echo the stories of centuries past. Whether these experiences were manifestations of residual fear, architectural acoustics, or something beyond comprehension, they reinforced the enduring power of the legend, keeping the memory of the king and his dark reign alive in ways that purely factual accounts never could. The legend of the king and his palace, then, is a story of transformation. What began as documented acts of cruelty evolved into oral tradition, then artistic expression, and finally into a paranormal mythos that continues to captivate imaginations. It is a tale that bridges the gap between history and horror, grounding its terror in human behavior while amplifying it through legend. The king's deeds, the suffering of his victims, and the labyrinthine horrors of the palace live on not only in historical record, but in the collective memory, forever entwined with whispers, shadows, and the unrelenting sense that the past refuses to release its grip. In understanding how the legend grew, we see more than mere embellishment. We see the enduring power of fear, the human fascination with cruelty and mystery, and the ways in which stories serve as both warning and memory. The king may have vanished, but through legend, his reign of terror remains vividly alive, a haunting presence in history, folklore, and the imagination. It is a reminder that sometimes the story does not end when the tyrant dies. The horror persists, carried forward in whispers, shadows, and the ever-growing legend that refuses to fade. To understand the full horror of the king's reign, one must look beyond the locked chambers, the whispers, and the legend itself. One must attempt to enter the labyrinth of his mind, a place as intricate, twisted, and terrifying as the palace he ruled. The king was not a monster born overnight. He was a product of privilege, upbringing, and a mind consumed by obsession. From childhood, he displayed a fascination with control, an almost pathological curiosity about fear, obedience, and the fragility of human life. Tutors and mentors marveled at his intellect, yet whispered of an intensity that bordered on mania, a relentless focus on minutiae and behavior that few could comprehend. As he ascended the throne, these tendencies did not dissipate, they evolved. The responsibilities of rulership, combined with absolute power, became the perfect medium for the dark corners of his psyche to manifest. Advisors noted that the king was both brilliant and unpredictable. He could negotiate treaties with extraordinary skill, yet punish a minor infraction with terrifying precision. He observed human behavior with scientific detachment, cataloging reactions, moods, and fears, yet rarely allowed empathy to influence his decisions. In essence, the king's mind operated like a laboratory, except the subjects were living human beings, and the experiments were brutal, psychological, and often fatal. Modern psychological frameworks, when applied retrospectively, offer some insight. Historians and psychologists suggest that the king exhibited traits consistent with obsessive-compulsive behavior, paranoia, and psychopathy. His need for control extended to every aspect of the palace, from the grandest ceremony to the most private chamber. He could manipulate emotions with uncanny precision, instill fear through subtle gestures, and erase trust with a single glance. Yet these traits were interwoven with brilliance. He was strategic, charismatic, and capable of extraordinary insight into human nature. This combination of intellect and moral detachment made him uniquely terrifying. He understood fear, but he felt no moral restraint in using it. Isolation played a key role in shaping his psychological profile. From a young age, the king retreated into private spaces, often preferring solitude to social interaction. This withdrawal, coupled with his innate curiosity and obsessive tendencies, created a feedback loop of control and experimentation. The more he withdrew, the more he observed, manipulated, and tested those around him. Courtiers became subjects, servants instruments, and the very architecture of the palace a tool for psychological domination. Every lock, corridor, and hidden chamber reflected the inner workings of a mind that sought to impose absolute order on the chaos of human behavior. The king's fascination with fear itself is particularly telling. Unlike rulers who employ fear for political ends alone, he seemed compelled to study it, to dissect it, and to integrate it into his rituals. The locked chambers, sensory deprivation, and manipulative ceremonies were not merely punitive. They were experimental, a systematic approach to understanding the human response to terror. Victims were stripped of autonomy, exposed to isolation, and subjected to situations designed to magnify anxiety and despair. Each reaction was observed, noted, and sometimes incorporated into further experimentation. In this, the king's cruelty merged seamlessly with his intellect, producing a psychological tyranny that was both innovative and horrifying. Yet, paradoxically, the king was not entirely devoid of fascination with humanity. He often selected his victims based on traits he admired: intelligence, wit, beauty, or courage. This only amplified the horror of their treatment. For those most capable of resisting or inspiring curiosity were often the most vulnerable to his obsessions. It was not random cruelty. It was targeted, calculated, and deeply personal. The king's mind functioned on layers of observation and selection, each decision designed to manipulate, intimidate, or erase the will of those around him.
The king's psychological profile is also marked by a profound detachment from morality. While he understood the social codes of behavior expected of a ruler, he seemed incapable of moral empathy. Human suffering became data, obedience became a variable, fear became a tool. Even acts that might seem sadistic were often executed with clinical precision, calculated to maximize the psychological impacts while minimizing physical traces. It is the detachment that separates historical tyrants from the extraordinary terror of the king. Each generous was intertwined with each capacity for cruelty, making him unpredictably, omnipresent, and extraordinarily dangerous. Family history and upbringing may also have played a role. Historical fragments suggest a lineage marked by ambition, secrecy, and ruthless pursuit of power. The king inherited not only the throne but a psychological framework that valued control above compassion, domination above cooperation. Childhood experiences, combined with this inherited mindset, created fertile ground for obsession to flourish. Coupled with the isolation and absolute authority of monarchy, the conditions were perfect for a mind both brilliant and monstrous to dominate the lives all within the police. The king's psychological complexity is further revealed in each use of symbolism and ritual. He did not merely confine or punish, he created meaning around control, fear, and suffering. Candles ranged in precise geometries, mirrors that reflected distorted images, rooms designed to manipulate perception or speak to a mind capable of abstract, symbolic thought, are light in the service of terror. The rituals were experiments in perception, cognition, and emotional endurance, blending the intellectual with the sadistic. In this, he was both an artist and a scientist of fear, orchestrating human behavior as a current per the conducts a ceremony except the music was despair, and the instruments were living, breathing human beings. Even the legacy of HA's psychological imprint extended beyond HA's immediate victims. Courtiers, servants, and advisors were forced to internalize HA's presence, anticipating HA's reactions, interpreting HA's gestures, and navigating a labyrinth of fear that existed both physically and mentally. Fear became a shared consciousness, a living entity within the police. The king's obsessions created a world in which everyone even to touched directly by ideas cruelty was ensnared in the architecture of ideas' mind. Ultimately, the psychological portrait of the king is one of paradox, brilliance and madness, observation and detachment, cruelty and meticulous calculation. He was a man capable of extraordinary intellect, political acumen, and strategic thinking, yet consumed by obsession with control, isolation, and fear. Understanding this duality is crucial. Warrior allows us to comprehend not only the historical facts of HA's reign, but the mechanism through which terror was enacted and perpetuated. The mind of the king was a laboratory, a police, and a prison all at once, a place where human beings were studied, manipulated, and sometimes destroyed, and where the architecture of fear became as real as stone and mortar. In exploring HA's psychological makeup, we see why the king's reign has endured not only in history but in legend. He was more than a tyrant. He was a strategist of fear, a manipulator of minds, and a creator of horror that extended far beyond the physical. HA's genius was inseparable from HA's cruelty, HA's interest entwined with obsession, and HA's legacy in crime and raw water cares when absolute power intersects with an unrestrained, obsessive mind.
Even centuries after the king vanished, the palace seemed to hum with life, a life that was not human, yet neither entirely absent. Those who entered its corridors spoke of phenomena that defied explanation. Flickering lights in empty halls, sudden chills that could not be attributed to drafts, and shadows that moved independently of the natural flow of candlelight. Paranormal investigators, historians, and folklorists alike have documented these occurrences, noting a striking consistency in the experiences reported. The palace, it seemed, had absorbed the traumas, obsessions, and horrors of its past, creating a space where the echoes of suffering could linger indefinitely. Visitors describe entering the palace and immediately sensing a weight in the air, a subtle pressure that seemed to press against the chest and constrict breathing. It is as though the very stone and mortar remembered the terror enacted within its walls, projecting it outward for those sensitive enough to perceive it. In some corridors, footsteps echo where no one walks, and doors that are carefully closed appear to swing open on their own. These experiences are not isolated incidents. Multiple independent reports suggest that the palace functions as a kind of repository for residual fear, a place where the emotional energy of centuries past has taken on a tangible, almost conscious form. Shadow phenomena are particularly notable. Guests and investigators report fleeting silhouettes glimpsed from the corner of the eye, figures that vanish when directly observed. Some describe seeing shapes that appear to mimic human behavior, pacing or gesturing in ways that mirror the movements of the living. Local folklore interprets these shadows as the restless spirits of victims who perished or vanished within the king's locked chambers. Skeptics argue that these experiences are the product of expectation, suggestion, or the natural play of light in old architecture. Yet the consistency, intensity, and emotional impact of these reports leave many convinced that something extraordinary persists in the palace. Perhaps most chilling are the auditory echoes. Whispers, moans, and faint cries are often reported emanating from areas that are otherwise empty. The sounds are sometimes coherent, fragments of speech, cries for help, or repetitive murmurs. Yet often they are unintelligible, carrying an emotional weight that cannot be ignored. Some believe these are residual imprints of the fear and suffering once inflicted by the king, a psychic residue embedded in the architecture itself. Others claim that the palace has become a liminal space, a threshold between the living world and the echoes of those trapped in its past. Regardless of interpretation, the auditory phenomena contribute to a pervasive sense of unease, reinforcing the palace's reputation as a site of both historical horror and paranormal activity. There are also reports of sudden environmental changes within the palace. Rooms that were previously warm or calm can become icy, with temperatures dropping dramatically without any visible cause. Candles extinguish spontaneously, only to reignite moments later. Objects shift position, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, as if influenced by an unseen force. Visitors often report a sensation of being watched, accompanied by a primal fear that seems to originate from nowhere, yet is impossible to dismiss. These incidents suggest an environment that is alive not with the living, but with the lingering consciousness of past trauma. One of the most compelling phenomena involves apparitions. Witnesses describe full-bodied figures appearing in hallways, mirrors, or at the edges of vision. Some take the form of servants or courtiers in historical attire, while others appear as shadowy, indistinct forms, their features obscured. These sightings are sometimes accompanied by sudden drops in temperature or a feeling of pressure, suggesting a link between physical sensation and the visual phenomena. Paranormal investigators have theorized that these apparitions may be echoes of extreme emotional or psychological states, imprinted onto the environment by the intensity of fear, suffering, and obsessive control that characterized the king's reign. The connection between history and paranormal activity is particularly striking. Many of the reported phenomena occur in the same areas associated with documented cruelty or legend. Hidden chambers, corridors where victims vanished, and rooms believed to have been used for ritual. Visitors who study the palace carefully note that areas of extreme emotional significance in history seem disproportionately affected by unexplained events. This convergence of historical documentation, folklore, and contemporary experience creates a compelling narrative in which the past and the present coexist in a liminal, haunting space. Local folklore often provides context or interpretation for these paranormal echoes. Stories tell of the spirits of victims lingering in the locked chambers, unable to find rest, replaying the fear and despair inflicted upon them. Some tales speak of the king himself appearing in spectral form, wandering corridors in an eternal exercise of control. These legends serve both as cultural memory and as an explanation for the inexplicable phenomena, linking human storytelling with the sensory experiences reported by visitors. The paranormal dimension thus becomes inseparable from the historical narrative, reinforcing the sense that the palace is a living testament to obsession, cruelty, and terror. Psychologists and paranormal researchers alike note the powerful interplay between expectation and perception. Those who enter the palace with knowledge of its history often report heightened experiences, as if the mind is tuned to the residual energy of past events. Yet even skeptics, entering without prior knowledge, frequently report feelings of dread, the sensation of being observed, or anomalous sensory experiences. Whether these phenomena are the result of architecture, psychology, or something beyond scientific explanation remains a matter of debate, but the intensity and consistency of the reports suggest that the palace retains a palpable connection to its past horrors. In the end, the paranormal echoes of the palace do more than frighten. They bear witness. They serve as reminders of the lives consumed, the obsessions enacted, and the human suffering endured within its walls. The palace is more than a relic. It is a conduit, a space where history, legend, and the unexplained converge. Visitors and investigators alike report leaving with an altered sense of reality, a heightened awareness of the human capacity for cruelty, and a lingering impression that the echoes of the past have not yet faded. Through these paranormal experiences, the legacy of the king and his victims endures in a visceral, immediate way. The stone corridors, the locked chambers, and the shadowed hallways all resonate with the memory of terror, creating a haunting continuum between history and the supernatural. It is a chilling reminder that while rulers may fall, their influence, especially when intertwined with obsession, cruelty, and ritual, can linger far longer than the span of a human life. In the Palace of Shadows, the past is never truly past. It reverberates, whispers, and sometimes even moves, leaving those who enter to confront the haunting consequences of unchecked power. For centuries, the palace and the king's reign were shrouded in rumor, legend, and fragmented historical accounts. Yet buried within these layers of story, whispers, and myth were truths long concealed, waiting to be uncovered. Scholars, archaeologists, and historians gradually began piecing together fragments of documents, private letters, and physical remnants within the palace itself. What emerged was a picture far more chilling and intricate than folklore alone could convey, a web of cruelty, obsession, and hidden designs that extended beyond the palace walls and into the very foundations of the kingdom. One of the most striking revelations concerns the meticulous record-keeping the king maintained. Far from being chaotic or purely instinctual in his cruelty, the monarch documented almost every interaction, observation, and incident involving his victims. These records, recently rediscovered in hidden archives and secret compartments, reveal a man obsessed with cataloging human behavior as though it were a natural experiment. Every act of defiance, every quiver of fear, every hesitation in a courtesan's step was noted with precision. These records are not only evidence of his meticulous nature, they are testimony to a mind fixated on understanding, controlling, and ultimately breaking the human spirit. The discovery of hidden chambers in unexplored wings of the palace confirms suspicions long whispered among historians. Some of these rooms have been deliberately erased from official plans, accessible only via concealed passages that could easily be missed. Archaeologists found remnants of cages, iron rings embedded in stone floors, and walls lined with carvings whose symbolic meaning remains partially undeciphered. Inscriptions suggest that the king regarded these chambers as laboratories for experimentation with fear, isolation, and obedience. Human suffering, in his view, was not collateral damage. It was data, and each victim was an unwitting participant in a vast, ongoing study of the psyche. Letters recovered from exiled or displaced courtiers provide further context. In their words, we glimpse a court paralyzed by fear, yet observant enough to recognize the king's patterns. Some describe attempts to secretly aid victims, smuggling food, or offering brief words of comfort, only to be discovered and punished. Others recount cryptic warnings, do not linger where the shadows breathe, and the walls themselves record your fears. These communications illuminate not only the pervasive terror that gripped the palace, but the extraordinary lengths to which individuals went to navigate, survive, and sometimes resist the king's oppressive influence. Artifacts discovered alongside these documents deepen our understanding of the king's psychological and ritualistic obsessions. Mirrors, geometrically arranged candles, and ceremonial implements were often left in the chambers, reinforcing the idea that the king's cruelty was entwined with his fascination with symbolism and control. Some objects appear designed to manipulate perception, to warp reality in the minds of those trapped inside. Others suggest a merging of superstition and obsession, with the king performing acts intended to confer protection or power, while simultaneously amplifying fear and submission. The physical evidence aligns eerily with folklore, lending credibility to tales once dismissed as exaggeration. Even more disturbing is the evidence of selective cruelty. The king did not punish at random. Victims were chosen for specific reasons: beauty, intelligence, loyalty, or simply the potential to elicit fear. Those who were most resilient were often the most intensely studied, their reactions cataloged meticulously. This is not the behavior of a tyrant acting solely out of whim. It is the work of a mind deeply engaged in observation, experiment, and the orchestration of human suffering. Each victim was both punished and studied, reduced to a combination of material and information, stripped of humanity while serving as a tool in the king's obsessive quest for control. Hidden correspondence between the king and his advisors offers insight into the broader implications of his obsessions. Some letters suggest that he believed these acts of cruelty reinforced his divine right to rule, as if controlling the psyche of those around him were equivalent to asserting cosmic order. Others hint at darker motivations, including attempts to harness fear and suffering for personal or mystical advantage. While the truth of these motivations may never be fully known, the surviving evidence paints a picture of deliberate, calculated action that extended far beyond ordinary governance or punishment. The uncovering of these hidden truths also reshapes our understanding of the victims themselves. For decades, they were reduced to statistics, names, or fragments of folklore. Now, their experiences can be partially reconstructed. The young servant trapped in a pitch-black chamber for weeks, the court musician compelled to perform in a mirrored hall, the page observed endlessly as he navigated shifting corridors. Each account, pieced together from documents, artifacts, and oral history, restores a measure of individuality and humanity to those whose lives were commandeered by obsession. It is a grim, sobering reconstruction, but one that brings clarity to a story long dominated by myth. The revelation of hidden architectural features also explains the longevity of fear in the palace. Concealed passages, false walls, and secret locks were not merely defensive. They were integral to the king's ability to manipulate perception, track movements, and maintain a network of surveillance that kept everyone in a state of anxiety. Even spaces that appear ordinary today bear subtle traces of these hidden designs, evidence of a ruler who understood the interplay between physical space, psychology, and power. The palace itself becomes a character in the story, an extension of the king's mind and a repository of the suffering he orchestrated. Finally, the recovered truths provide a bridge between history, legend, and the paranormal. Many of the reported ghostly apparitions, flickering lights, and unexplained sounds are concentrated in locations corroborated by historical evidence of cruelty, confinement, or ritual. The convergence of documentation, archaeology, and eyewitness accounts reinforces the notion that what was once dismissed as folklore has a tangible basis in historical events. The palace, in this light, becomes both a museum of human cruelty and a stage where the echoes of obsession and fear continue to resonate, haunting the spaces the king once dominated with such meticulous control. In revealing these hidden truths, we confront the full complexity of the king's reign. He was not merely a tyrant in the political sense, but a manipulator of reality, perception, and human psychology. The artifacts, documents, and architectural discoveries shed light on a mind consumed by obsession, yet also illuminate the profound resilience and vulnerability of his victims. The horror of the palace, once relegated to legend, becomes concrete, grounded in evidence, yet amplified by the lingering whispers, shadows, and echoes that persist to this day. Through these revelations, we gain a more complete, unsettling understanding of history. The king's obsession was total, his cruelty methodical, and his genius inseparable from his capacity for terror. The palace, its hidden chambers, and the echoes that haunt them stand as enduring monuments to human obsession, the fragility of power, and the horrifying ways in which control can be exercised over both body and mind. These hidden truths, finally brought to light, reveal not only the scale of suffering, but also the extraordinary lengths to which one human mind can manipulate, dominate, and haunt the lives of others. The shadows of the king's reign stretched far beyond his lifetime, lingering not only in the palace corridors, but in the collective memory of his kingdom and beyond. His reign, marked by obsession, cruelty, and manipulation, created a legacy that would endure for centuries. One defined by fear, whispered warnings, and an enduring fascination with the extremes of human behavior. Even after the physical structures of the palace crumbled or were repurposed, the psychological imprint of his rule remained, seeping into stories, rituals, and local folklore that carried his name like a cautionary echo through generations. The immediate legacy was fear itself. Servants, courtiers, and even the nobility who survived his reign were forever marked by the experience of being watched, measured, and catalogued. Generations of those who had interacted with the king passed down memories laced with terror, not as mere anecdotes, but as warnings. Children were told to behave, not merely for obedience, but to avoid invoking the invisible presence of a ruler who might still haunt the psyche of those who dare disobey. The palace had become more than a seat of power. It had become a symbol of omnipresent control, a reminder that fear, when wielded skillfully, could outlast even death. Over time, the king's legacy took on almost mythical proportions. Travelers and storytellers spread tales of the locked chambers, the secret rituals, and the psychological torment enacted within the walls of the palace. With each retelling, the narrative grew darker, embellishing events with spectral sightings and supernatural consequences. Some claimed that the king's spirit continued to roam the corridors, exacting vengeance or perpetuating the same obsessions that had defined his life. Others warned that the very architecture of the palace had absorbed his intent, turning the stone and mortar into conduits of terror for anyone who dared enter. These stories blurred the line between historical record and legend, creating a legacy that was both factual and mythic, real and hauntingly symbolic. The impact extended beyond folklore. Scholars and historians who later investigated the king's reign found that the culture of fear he instilled influenced governance, social behavior, and even artistic expression in the decades that followed. Literature and art from the period reflect themes of confinement, surveillance, and obsession, suggesting that the psychological atmosphere created by the king resonated far beyond his immediate victims. Writers, poets, and chroniclers infused their works with allegories of hidden terror, subtly preserving memory while exploring the moral and psychological consequences of unchecked authority. In this way, his reign became a template for understanding the darker aspects of human power, control, and fear. Even in architecture, the king's influence persisted. Palaces built or renovated in the years after his death often incorporated features that reflected his obsession with control, hidden passages, observation points, and complex lock systems. While some historians argue these designs were practical or defensive, others suggest that they represent a cultural inheritance of psychological manipulation. The very concept of surveillance and the use of architecture as a tool of fear became embedded in the collective consciousness, demonstrating the enduring reach of the king's vision. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this legacy is its psychological resonance. Fear, once introduced and meticulously cultivated, does not vanish easily. Generations of palace inhabitants internalized the lessons of observation, obedience, and terror. Even those with no direct contact with the king were influenced by the stories, rumors, and rituals that surrounded his memory. In this sense, the legacy of fear was self-perpetuating, passed from master to servant, from parent to child, from storyteller to listener. The kingdom became, in effect, an extended laboratory for the study of obedience and terror, long after the king himself had disappeared. The cultural fascination with the king also evolved into a form of macabre intrigue. Folklorists, historians, and paranormal enthusiasts were drawn to the palace, compelled to explore its hidden chambers and investigate the stories of shadows, whispers, and lingering presences. Each visit reinforced the sense that the king's reach had transcended mortality, embedding his influence in both physical space and the imagination of successive generations. The palace became a site of pilgrimage not for admiration, but for confrontation with the extremes of human obsession and cruelty, a dark museum where the past could be experienced, studied, and feared. Modern interpretations of the king's legacy reveal a complex interplay between horror and fascination. Psychologists and sociologists study the mechanisms by which fear was cultivated, maintained, and internalized, examining how his reign provides a blueprint for understanding tyranny, obsession, and the psychology of control. Meanwhile, Paranormal researchers explore the residual phenomena that continue to emanate from the palace, suggesting that fear, once so intensely concentrated, leaves traces that persist across time and perception. The legacy is therefore multifaceted: historical, psychological, architectural, and supernatural, each element reinforcing the others in a continuum of influence. The enduring fascination with the king is also rooted in the human fascination with taboo and extremity. His reign represents the intersection of absolute power, obsession, and cruelty, a combination that is at once horrifying and compelling. By studying the king, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature: the capacity for calculated cruelty, the allure of domination, and the consequences of unchecked authority. These lessons, encoded in the stories, artifacts, and architecture he left behind, remain relevant centuries later, offering both a warning and a mirror to the darker facets of society and human psychology. Ultimately, the king's legacy of fear is inseparable from the stories of those who suffered under him. Each whispered tale, each architectural remnant, each paranormal account contributes to a composite memory of terror that refuses to fade. It is a reminder that human actions, especially those driven by obsession, control, and cruelty, can echo long after the actor has vanished, shaping culture, memory, and even the physical environment. In this way, the king's shadow endures, a haunting testament to the power of fear as a tool, a weapon, and a legacy that outlives the mortal life that created it. In reflecting on this legacy, we see a full spectrum of influence: fear that manipulates, architecture that confines, rituals that dominate, and stories that preserve memory. The king may have been mortal, but his obsessions, cruelty, and meticulous manipulation of human psychology became immortal. The legacy of fear is therefore not merely historical. It is cultural, psychological, and deeply human, a reminder of the delicate balance between authority and morality, obsession and reason, and the enduring power of terror when wielded with intelligence and intent. As the sun sets over the crumbling facades of the palace, its long shadows stretch across stone and courtyard, reaching into the past as though trying to grasp the events that transpired within. The reign of the king, once a sequence of documented cruelty and obsession, now exists in a liminal space where history, folklore, and legend converge. His chambers, corridors, and hidden spaces, though silent today, still speak to those who enter with sensitivity and imagination. The shadows that remain are not merely metaphorical. They're the lingering echoes of fear, control, and obsession, a testament to the extraordinary, often unfathomable power one individual can wield over many. Reflecting on his life and reign, one sees the full spectrum of human behavior: brilliance intertwined with depravity, intellect fused with obsession, authority exercised through terror. The king was both ruler and experimenter, philosopher and manipulator, a man whose genius could not be separated from his cruelty. His methods were not simple acts of punishment, but carefully calculated exercises in psychological domination, each action and architectural choice amplifying fear, obedience, and dependence. The palace itself was an extension of his mind, a living canvas upon which terror was painted with meticulous precision, and from which shadows still whisper the horrors of his reign. The victims of the king, whose names and lives were often erased or reduced to rumor, continue to haunt our understanding of history. Locked away in chambers designed to strip away identity, subjected to isolation, sensory manipulation, and constant observation, they bore the full weight of a mind obsessed with control. Their stories, once buried or lost to legend, now emerge through documents, artifacts, and oral traditions, reminding us that history is not only shaped by rulers, but by those who endure, resist, and survive. Each chamber, each hidden corridor, each trace of suffering carries the memory of these individuals, ensuring that they are not forgotten, even as centuries pass. The legend, enhanced by folklore and paranormal accounts, ensures that the king's influence transcends his own lifetime. Visitors to the palace describe shadows, whispers, and inexplicable phenomena, residual impressions of intense fear and suffering that continue to manifest centuries later. These experiences illustrate the uncanny persistence of trauma, both human and architectural, and how stories, legends, and memories can interact with space and perception to create a haunting continuity. In this way, the palace exists as a living museum of terror, a site where the past continues to communicate with the present, bridging the gap between history and myth. Yet there is more than mere horror in this legacy. The story of the king and his victims also reflects the complexity of human resilience. Survivors, courtiers, and even ordinary inhabitants of the kingdom found ways to endure, adapt, and sometimes resist the oppressive structures imposed upon them. Acts of subtle defiance, coded messages, and whispered assistance reveal that even under extreme fear, the human spirit can find means of survival. The echoes that remain, then, are not only of terror, but of endurance, memory, and the quiet acts of courage that history often overlooks. In a broader sense, the shadows that linger remind us of the enduring relevance of understanding power, obsession, and cruelty. The king's reign is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a study of human behavior, the psychology of fear, and the mechanisms by which authority can be exercised and abused. His methods, though extreme, illuminate patterns that recur in various forms across societies and eras, demonstrating how control, surveillance, and manipulation can shape behavior long after the immediate events have ended. The shadows, both literal and metaphorical, persist as warnings, teaching us about the fragility of freedom, the costs of obedience, and the enduring power of fear. The palace, its architecture, and the stories that surround it are ultimately inseparable from the narrative of human obsession and cruelty. From the locked chambers to the corridors lined with observation points, every element tells a story of calculated terror. Even centuries later, those who walk its halls sense a presence, an invisible force shaped by memory, legend, and residual emotion. The shadows that remain are more than historical residue. They are an invitation to confront the extremes of human behavior, to examine the interplay of power, psychology, and fear, and to acknowledge the profound consequences of obsession left unchecked. As we step away from the palace, leaving behind stone, shadow, and whisper, the narrative lingers in the mind, compelling reflection. The king may have been mortal, his reign finite, and his body long gone, but the architecture of fear, the memories of victims, and the echoes of legend remain alive. They remind us that history is never merely past. It resonates, instructs, and warns. Every whisper, shadow, and hidden chamber is a story, a lesson, and a memory etched into the fabric of time. In the end, the story of the king who locked himself away with his victims is a story of extremes, of brilliance and madness, of control and fear, of human cruelty and resilience. The shadows that remain are not silent. They speak of lives lived, lost, and remembered, of a legacy that continues to captivate, terrify, and educate. And those centuries separate us from the events. The palace and its stories endure, inviting us to confront the darkness within history and perhaps within ourselves. The shadows remain. They always will.